The woods at night have always held a peculiar kind of terror. There's something inherently unsettling about the way shadows stretch and twist when there's no moonlight to guide you. The way the wind whispers through the leaves like a warning you can't quite understand. It's a fear that isn't always about what you can see, but what you can't. And when you're deep in the middle of nowhere, that fear intensifies tenfold. In these stories, the kind of horror that creeps into your bones doesn't always announce itself with a scream. It creeps slowly, lingering in the silence, waiting for the moment you let your guard down. Our first story begins with a man named Daniel, a seasoned hiker who had spent decades exploring trails most people avoided. He prided himself on his preparation, carrying everything from GPS trackers to survival kits. But even the most prepared can stumble into situations beyond comprehension. One autumn evening, Daniel decided to hike through a stretch of forest that locals called the Whispering Pines. The name alone carried a sense of foreboding. But Daniel, logical and rational, dismissed the rumors of disappearances as the product of small-town superstition. He started his hike at dusk, the sun dipping low behind the trees, casting long distorted shadows across the leaf-strewn path. As he delved deeper, Daniel began to notice subtle anomalies. Footprints, not entirely human, appeared on the narrow dirt path, leading both forwards and backwards in impossible patterns. The air grew colder, and the sounds of wildlife faded until all he could hear was the crunch of his own boots. Suddenly, he heard something, or rather someone, breathing nearby. He stopped, trying to locate the source, but there was nothing. Just the occasional rustle of leaves, though the trees were still. Daniel called out, his voice echoing unnaturally, almost swallowed by the forest itself. No answer came, but the breathing continued, ever closer, ever more deliberate. Hours seemed to stretch unnaturally as Daniel pushed forward, only to find himself in a small clearing he didn't remember passing before. In the center of the clearing was a tree, gnarled and ancient, with what appeared to be markings carved deep into the bark. As he approached, the markings seemed to twist in the shadows, forming shapes that his mind could barely comprehend. Faces contorted in silent screams, eyes that seemed to follow him wherever he moved. Daniel's rational mind screamed that it was just a trick of the light. Yet an instinctual terror took hold, urging him to flee. That's when he heard the whispers. Not a single voice, but many, layered and overlapping, murmuring indistinct words he couldn't understand. The forest itself seemed alive, pressing in from all sides, leaving him disoriented. Daniel turned to leave, only to find the path he had taken vanished, replaced by endless trees that all looked identical. Panic set in, and he ran blindly, tripping over roots, tearing his clothes, and yet the whispers remained just behind him, never close enough to touch, never far enough to ignore. Eventually, He stumbled upon an abandoned cabin, the kind that appears out of nowhere in the middle of the woods, forgotten by time. The windows were shattered, the door barely hanging on its hinges. Exhausted and terrified, Daniel entered, hoping to find shelter or at least a moment to gather his thoughts. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the faint outline of furniture hinted at a long-forgotten life. But the most disturbing detail was a single chair in the center of the room, facing a wall, with a set of scratches etched into the floor around it. Marks that suggested frantic movement, pacing, desperation. Daniel, now fully engulfed in dread, approached the chair, compelled by a mixture of curiosity and fear. That's when he realized he wasn't alone. The whispers crescendoed into something more distinct, forming words that froze his blood. "You shouldn't have come here." He turned, but the cabin appeared empty. A sudden slam of the door behind him made him jump, and when he turned back toward the chair, it was no longer facing the wall. It was facing him. He ran, ignoring the pain in his legs and the thorns that tore at his skin, until he finally burst out of the forest and onto a road that seemed to appear out of thin air. He collapsed there, gasping, covered in scratches and bruises, the whispers still echoing faintly in his mind. People later claimed the area of the Whispering Pines had been abandoned for decades, the locals speaking of a series of disappearances that were never solved. Daniel never returned, but he often wakes in the middle of the night, convinced he can still hear those whispers calling him back. Our second story is no less unsettling. This one involves a group of friends, college students, who decided to go camping in a forest so remote that even cell service was a luxury. They called it the Backwoods Experiment, a weekend designed to push boundaries and confront fears. The forest, they said, was rumored to be haunted. But this was just an excuse for thrill-seeking, a dare to prove they weren't afraid of a few ghost stories. The first night went as expected, filled with laughter, campfires, and ghost stories told to scare themselves before sleep. But as the night deepened, strange occurrences began. Tents were unzipped while everyone was asleep, only to find the contents rearranged. Shoes disappeared and reappeared in odd locations, and shadows moved in ways that defied physics. At first, they laughed it off as pranks. But then, one of them, Maya, swore she saw a figure outside her tent, completely still, staring. She woke the others, and by the time they shined a flashlight outside, nothing was there. The next day, they found faint trails in the mud leading deeper into the forest. Trails none of them had taken. Their attempts to retrace their steps were futile. Each path seemed to loop back on itself, never quite matching their memories. Anxiety grew, and the air felt thicker, heavier, as if the forest itself was aware of them. That night, the terror escalated. Whispers echoed from nowhere. Footsteps circled their camp, and the fire inexplicably died multiple times despite their attempts to relight it. Fear, which had been playful the night before, became palpable. Around midnight, one of the friends, Alex, went missing. There was no struggle, no signs of a fight, just silence. Panic overtook the group, and they searched desperately, shouting his name. But the forest responded with silence, the kind that feels oppressive, almost sentient. Hours later, they found him at the edge of a clearing, staring blankly, unmoving. When they approached, he didn't recognize them. His eyes vacant, his voice gone. They fled the forest, leaving their tents and belongings behind, shaken to their cores. To this day, Alex's mind has never fully recovered. The details of that night lost even to him. There's something about isolation in the woods that changes the mind, something primal that awakens fears we don't confront in our daily lives. And these stories, terrifying as they are merely a glimpse into the unknown, a taste of the darkness that waits when civilization is stripped away, leaving you exposed and vulnerable to forces you cannot see, forces that may not even be human. Not all haunted experiences in the middle of nowhere are supernatural. Sometimes the terror comes from human malice, the kind that preys on those who venture too far from safety. One man, Tom, a photographer who specialized in abandoned places, found himself deep in a forest in the Midwest. He was tracking old logging towns, documenting their decay, unaware that some ruins are avoided for reasons that go beyond disrepair. Tom set up camp near the remnants of a long-forgotten town, with crumbling houses and broken-down barns. That night, he noticed something odd. Shadows moving in the distance, figures he couldn't identify. Initially, he assumed it was wildlife, but the shapes were too upright, too deliberate. He tried to ignore them, convincing himself it was his imagination. But as hours passed, the figures moved closer, their silhouettes sharp and menacing in the moonlight. When Tom reached for his camera to capture evidence, the device malfunctioned, the screen flickering with static. Then he heard voices, low, guttural, speaking in a language he didn't recognize. Panic overtook him, and he packed hastily, intending to leave immediately. But the forest seemed alive, paths shifting, trails disappearing. The town he thought he knew transforming into a maze of uncertainty. Eventually, he escaped the forest, but not unscathed. He reported seeing figures watching from treetops for weeks after. A lingering presence that followed him even back to civilization. Though skeptical friends dismissed his story as stress-induced hallucinations, Tom knew the truth. Some places harbor a darkness that's patient, intelligent, and infinitely more terrifying than any ghost story. The woods, the middle of nowhere, the isolation, they strip away comfort, exposing the raw nerves of fear. And in these stories, that fear is not abstract. It is tactile, immediate, and inescapable. The characters are ordinary people, yet ordinary people can encounter horrors extraordinary enough to make the rational mind falter. These woods are not just empty spaces. They are living nightmares, silent yet attentive, waiting for someone to wander too far. The second night in these haunted woods often brings a different kind of terror. One that starts quietly, almost innocuously, and grows until it's impossible to ignore. It begins with the senses. You notice the cold, not just on your skin, but inside your chest. A chilling that seeps into your very bones. You hear the wind, and it isn't just wind anymore. It's a voice, soft but urgent, and it speaks in syllables your mind strains to understand. Many dismiss it at first, convinced that imagination plays tricks in isolation. But in the middle of nowhere, imagination can be deadly. Consider the story of Lena, a solo hiker with a love for remote trails. She had navigated forests in every season, confident in her skills. But one late October, she ventured into an area known for its thick fogs and tangled undergrowth. Locals whispered about disappearances over the decades. But Lena, pragmatic and self-assured, paid no heed. She set off early in the morning, her backpack filled with essentials, GPS in hand, headphones in for music along the trail. At first, the hike was serene. The golden sunlight filtering through amber leaves, the soft rustle of squirrels scurrying across the forest floor. By midday, however, something felt off. The path seemed longer than it should, curving in unnatural ways that didn't match her map. Birds were conspicuously absent, replaced by an eerie silence that made her steps feel amplified, echoing unnaturally. Lena paused, scanning the dense forest around her. Shadows stretched and contracted in ways that defied logic, bending along the contours of unseen hollows. That's when she noticed the first clue. Footprints, fresh but indecipherable, moving beside hers without crossing paths, as though she weren't alone, but followed by someone or something that mimicked her every step. Fear prickled the edges of her mind, though she tried to rationalize it. She was alone, experienced, prepared. The footprints must belong to another hiker. Yet when she called out, her voice returned, not as a reflection, but as a distortion, echoing wrong, warped. The forest responded to her in a way that felt sentient, as though it were testing her awareness, gauging her reactions. Shadows flickered beyond her line of sight, and the faint murmur of words began weaving through the trees. Incoherent, yet undeniably human in tone. As night approached, Lena realized she had strayed far from any recognizable trail. Her GPS blinked erratically, showing positions that were impossible. Her path appeared to double back on itself, the digital map becoming almost useless. Panic rose, a familiar tightness gripping her chest, urging her to act before the forest could claim her. She attempted to retrace her steps, but the trees seemed to rearrange themselves, branches forming barriers where paths once existed. It was as though the forest had a memory, a will, and a purpose. Then she saw it. A cabin, barely visible through the fog. The structure old and weathered, its wood warped and creaking. Instinctively, she approached, hoping for shelter or at least temporary refuge. The door was ajar, inviting yet menacing. Inside, it was empty, except for a single rocking chair that moved gently, as though pushed by unseen hands. On the wall, crude drawings depicted figures with elongated limbs and hollow eyes, arranged in scenes of unspeakable torment. Lena felt a chill so intense that her muscles seized, her breath visible in the dim light. She considered fleeing, but the cabin door slammed shut before she could move, trapping her inside. The whispers intensified, forming phrases that sliced through her mind. "You don't belong here. Stay." Her heart raced, rational thoughts struggling against the primal instinct to survive. Lena noticed a window, but the fog outside thickened when she approached, obscuring the world beyond, as if the forest were pressing against her, a living wall of mist and malevolence. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. It was impossible to tell. Time itself seemed suspended, distorted. Lena began to see figures at the edges of her vision. Tall, thin, featureless, gliding silently across the cabin floor, vanishing when she turned to confront them. Panic gave way to something deeper, a gnawing awareness that the forest had claimed her attention. That escape was not guaranteed by movement, but by understanding. She remembered stories of the woods, tales of those who vanished without a trace, leaving only whispered warnings behind. Lena now understood why. Some places in the wilderness don't just test your body, they manipulate your mind. Finally, dawn broke. The fog thinned slightly, revealing the path once again, though every landmark was subtly different from memory. Lena fled, not daring to look back until she reached a paved road far from the forest's edge. She had survived physically, but the mental scars remained. She would never forget the sensation of being watched, of being studied by an intelligence that was not human yet undeniably aware. The next story involves a pair of friends, Ryan and Marcus, who were camping far from civilization in an area called Hollow Pines. Unlike Lena, they had no plans to confront fear deliberately. They just wanted a weekend away from city life. But fear has a way of finding you, even when you are most comfortable. On the first night, they built a campfire and shared stories. The forest was alive with the ordinary sounds of crickets, distant owls, and rustling leaves. Everything seemed normal until they noticed the shadows around them, moving without any discernible source. At first they laughed, attributing it to firelight tricks. But then the temperature dropped sharply, their breaths visible in the warm midsummer air. The whispers began. indistinct but persistent, threading through the darkness. Ryan swore he saw a figure standing at the tree line, motionless, staring. When he blinked, it vanished. Marcus chalked it up to nerves. But unease settled in both men. The following morning, they found broken twigs and footprints around the campsite that neither of them recognized. That night, the forest revealed itself fully. Something, or someone, moved among the trees. The whispers became intelligible phrases. Leave, now. Before it's too late, fear morphed into desperation. Ryan tried to record the sound, hoping to capture evidence. But the camera failed. Every attempt to document the experience was met with electronic interference. Phones died. Batteries drained instantly, and cameras captured nothing but static. By the third night, the friends realized they were no longer just visitors. They were prey. In a final, desperate attempt to escape, they retraced their steps. But the forest had changed. Paths twisted, landmarks disappeared, and the sun set faster than it should have. At the edge of panic, Ryan stumbled upon an old rotting sign, partially buried in moss. Abandon all hope. It was a warning, ancient and chilling, and for the first time, they understood the stories they had dismissed. Hollow Pines was not merely a location. It was a trap, a sentient entity that lured wanderers into its depths, feeding on fear itself. The middle of nowhere often amplifies the ordinary into the extraordinary. Sounds become shapes, shapes become threats, and logic fades under the weight of isolation. Another hiker, Emily, experienced this when she ventured into an uncharted stretch of Appalachian forest. She had a love for extreme solitude, seeking places untouched by humans. But when the sun set and the shadows lengthened, she realized the forest had been watching, learning, anticipating her movements. Trees seemed to shift subtly when she wasn't looking, and whispers of voices, sometimes familiar, sometimes alien, echoed behind her. Emily's story escalates over several days. She encountered footprints that appeared and disappeared, animal sounds that mimicked human cries, and reflections in water that were not her own. Her attempts to leave were thwarted by paths that led back to the same clearing. No matter which direction she took, the psychological pressure mounted, producing hallucinations, memory lapses, and a creeping paranoia. When Emily finally found civilization, she was physically unharmed, but her sense of reality had fractured. The woods had imprinted themselves onto her mind, leaving traces that would never fade. These stories illustrate an undeniable truth. The forest, in its deepest, most remote forms, is more than a collection of trees. It is a space where human perception is tested, where fear becomes tangible, and where the veil between natural and supernatural thins. The middle of nowhere is not just empty. It is full of potential horrors, some living, some long dead, all waiting for someone unprepared to wander too far. Even the most experienced explorers can underestimate the subtle ways the forest can manipulate perception. It isn't always immediate. Often, it begins with small inconsistencies, things that don't sit right. A branch bent the wrong way, a rustle in the distance that doesn't belong to any animal, the sound of footsteps echoing when none should exist. Over time, these small disturbances accumulate, layering anxiety upon fear until the mind itself feels trapped. Take the case of Jonathan, a photographer who specialized in remote landscapes. He adventured into the northern wilderness, seeking mist-laden valleys for his portfolio. Jonathan was meticulous, always planning for every possible scenario. He had extra supplies, satellite communication devices, and emergency beacons. Yet, even with preparation, he found himself ensnared by forces that defied logic. The forest seemed to anticipate his every move, guiding him toward areas he hadn't intended to enter. It began with his photographs. Upon reviewing the images at night in his tent, he noticed shapes in the shadows, figures that were not visible when he took the shots. At first, he rationalized it as a trick of light, a result of long exposure in low light conditions. But as the days passed, the figures became more defined, more menacing. Faces with hollow eyes, limbs twisted at impossible angles, standing in places where no human could plausibly stand. Jonathan tried to dismiss these anomalies, but denial offered no comfort. On the third night, the forest's presence became undeniable. He heard faint whispers outside his tent, soft, melodic, yet unnerving. They spoke in fragmented sentences. "You're not alone. We see you. Stay." Jonathan peeked outside, but saw only the trees swaying in the wind. Still, he felt eyes upon him, an invisible gaze that tracked every movement. The wind carried faint scents too, a mix of decaying leaves, wet soil, and something darker, metallic, reminiscent of blood. His survival instincts screamed at him to leave. Yet the forest's maze-like topology thwarted every attempt. One morning, Jonathan awoke to find his equipment moved. His camera tripod was no longer near the tent, now positioned toward the heart of the woods, pointing at something unseen. Every attempt to track the disturbance revealed nothing. Paths he had walked the previous day were unrecognizable, as though the terrain itself had shifted overnight. Panic set in, but he maintained enough composure to note every detail in a journal, a record that he hoped might make sense of the madness later. Then came the figures, visible this time. Tall, thin, almost humanoid, yet impossible in proportion. They emerged from behind trees, standing silently, watching. Jonathan tried to move slowly, but the creatures mirrored his motions perfectly, gliding soundlessly over the undergrowth. Fear and fascination battled within him. Was this natural, supernatural, or a cruel trick of exhaustion and isolation? He would never know for certain, because as quickly as they appeared, they vanished, leaving only an oppressive stillness in their wake. In another part of the country, near the desolate plains of Montana, a young couple, Rachel and Ethan, experienced a different manifestation of forest terror. Their goal was simple: camp under the stars, escape city lights, enjoy quiet. They found a clearing surrounded by thick pines, set up a small fire, and relaxed into the evening. At first, all was normal. The crackle of the fire, the distant calls of nocturnal birds, the occasional rustle of small animals. Then the air shifted. Shadows moved independently of the firelight, bending and stretching in impossible directions. Rachel first noticed it: a reflection in her eyes, a movement in the corner of her vision. Ethan dismissed her concerns, joking about fatigue and overactive imaginations. But the experience escalated quickly. The whispers began, almost melodic at first, then urgent and sharp. "You shouldn't be here. Leave." The wind carried voices, indistinct yet unmistakably human, circling them in every direction. Panic rose. Their attempts to leave the clearing were futile. Every path they chose led them back to the same spot, as though the forest itself had grown walls overnight. As the night deepened, Rachel and Ethan noticed something worse. The trees themselves seemed alive. Branches swayed to block paths, shadows shifted to obscure landmarks, and leaves rustled in patterns that suggested a coordinated intelligence. The air felt thick, heavy, almost tangible, pressing against their skin. Fireflies, usually harmless, appeared in unnatural numbers, forming shapes, faces, symbols, words. The couple understood they were no longer visitors. They were prey, observed and manipulated by forces beyond comprehension. The psychological strain was relentless. Without sleep, every rustle became a threat. Every shadow, a potential predator. Their sense of time disintegrated. Minutes felt like hours, hours like days. Hunger and fatigue weakened their bodies, but the terror continued to escalate. Finally, just before dawn, they stumbled onto a hidden road. The forest receded slightly, letting them pass. Once back in civilization, they realized the forest had left marks. Not physical injuries, but lingering impressions in their minds. Vivid nightmares, and a permanent sense of unease when alone in nature. Isolation in haunted woods is often the catalyst for deeper horrors. Consider the story of Marcus, a solo adventurer who sought the thrill of deep, uncharted trails in Oregon. He carried little technology, relying on instinct and experience. At first, the solitude was intoxicating. The forest was alive with the natural rhythm of wind, birds, and creeks. But after 2 days, Marcus noticed a pattern. Strange symbols etched into bark, always appearing just as he passed. Shapes reminiscent of human figures, often distorted, surrounded by runic lines. He initially dismissed them as pranksters, but the locations were far from accessible trails. By the third night, the forest revealed its intent. Marcus awoke to whispers directly in his ears, even though no one was present. Figures moved between the trees, tall and shadowy, their presence more than visual. They were tangible, pressing on his mind. Attempts to escape led him in circles. Familiar landmarks shifted or disappeared entirely. In desperation, he began marking trees with chalk, only to find them erased or altered by the next morning. Marcus understood, with a growing dread, that the forest was alive in a way that was actively hostile. Even after returning home, Marcus felt the forest's influence linger. He experienced sudden auditory hallucinations, shadows at the corner of his eyes, and a sense of being watched. Sleep was disturbed by recurring dreams of the woods, dark and endless, with figures reaching from beyond the trees. He realized that some places don't release those who enter. They imprint themselves on the psyche, a lingering presence that can persist indefinitely. These experiences, while varied in specifics, share common threads: isolation, perception manipulation, and an almost sentient response from the environment. People who enter these haunted, middle-of-nowhere areas often report phenomena that defy explanation: lights in the distance that vanish on approach, paths that shift, whispers in unknown tongues, shadows that move with intent. Fear in these settings is not simply emotional. It becomes a tool the forest wields, shaping actions, thoughts, and decisions. Even in modern times, when GPS, maps, and technology are supposed to offer safety, these forests demonstrate limitations of human control. Electronic devices fail, paths warp, and perception itself becomes unreliable. Those who return often speak of changes in themselves: heightened paranoia, vivid dreams, sensitivity to light and sound, and a sense that the forest is still reaching for them long after they leave. The psychological impact is undeniable, as haunting as any physical injury. The middle of nowhere is deceptive. It promises peace, solitude, and clarity, but instead delivers uncertainty, dread, and confrontation with the unknown. For those unprepared, it can be transformative in terrifying ways. The woods are not simply empty spaces. They are dynamic landscapes interacting with those who enter. What is natural here may conceal the supernatural, and what is familiar may conceal terror. Travelers are left with a choice: respect the boundaries, or risk being consumed by curiosity and the unknowable. The haunting often escalates when multiple people enter these desolate forests together. There is a sense of shared vulnerability, a bond forged in fear, yet that bond can also amplify terror. Take the story of a group of 4 friends who ventured into the remote forests of West Virginia, seeking an adventure away from the digital world. They were well prepared, carrying tents, food, and cameras, confident that experience and camaraderie would shield them from harm. but they underestimated how quickly the forest could turn familiarity into dread. At first, the trip was idyllic. Birds sang, streams glistened, and the canopy filtered sunlight in a soft green glow. Yet, on the first night, things began to shift. One friend, Lily, awoke to hear footsteps circling the campsite. She shook the others, but no one heard anything. The shadows themselves seemed to stretch unnaturally, elongating and twisting as if alive. When the group reviewed their photographs, they noticed figures in the backgrounds that weren't there when the photos were taken. Tall, dark silhouettes with no discernible features. By the second night, the forest's influence intensified. The friends decided to hike deeper into the wilderness, believing movement would restore normalcy. That decision proved fatal. Trails that should have led to familiar clearings looped endlessly back to the same place. Trees seemed to rearrange themselves when no one was looking, forming walls of dense foliage. Panic set in, and subtle arguments began as the psychological pressure of isolation magnified. They realized that the forest wasn't just a backdrop, it was an active participant in their ordeal, shaping their environment to disorient and terrify. Then came the whispers. At first, faint murmurs, like wind rustling through leaves. Soon, they became distinct phrases. "You don't belong here. Leave now. Or stay forever." Every direction offered a voice. When the group tried to move, the sounds seemed to follow, shifting in space, disorienting them further. Fear became almost tangible, wrapping around them like fog. The forest's presence was undeniable. It was no longer passive. It was aware, calculating, and, most disturbingly, patient. On the third night, the supernatural became undeniable. Shadows coalesced into forms resembling the friends themselves, except distorted, grotesque, and observing silently from the edge of the camp. Every movement they made was mirrored by these figures, yet delayed slightly, as though the forest were testing them. Attempts to flee only led deeper into the woods. Panic turned to desperation when one of the friends, Mark, disappeared while retrieving firewood. The others searched frantically, calling his name, but the forest responded with silence. Hours later, Mark reappeared. He claimed he had never left the clearing, yet his clothing was torn and strange symbols were etched onto his skin. None of the others had been able to find these markings, nor did they recognize the symbols. That night, dreams became inescapable. Each friend experienced visions of endless trees, impossible angles, and glowing eyes in the darkness. They awoke with a shared feeling of being watched, as though the forest had infiltrated their minds. Psychologists who later spoke with the group suggested a phenomenon known as shared hallucination under stress. But the friends were adamant. These experiences were real. The forest's influence, extended beyond the physical into psychological and emotional domains. Even after leaving, all four reported recurring dreams, feelings of being followed, and a reluctance to enter wooded areas ever again. Their lives were forever altered, demonstrating how certain locations can leave lasting impressions on the human psyche. The stories don't stop there. In the Midwest, a lone hiker named Samuel sought solitude in a forest so dense that few maps detailed its interior. Samuel was an experienced outdoorsman, familiar with survival techniques and emergency navigation. However, what he encountered was beyond preparation. During a routine hike, he noticed subtle anomalies, rocks arranged in patterns that defied natural explanation, the ground appearing subtly distorted, and the occasional glimpse of something moving between the trees that didn't belong to any animal. By nightfall, Samuel had set up camp, but sleep proved elusive. The forest seemed to communicate in whispers, rustling leaves, and subtle vibrations in the soil. Every instinct screamed to leave, yet every path led deeper into the heart of the woods. Over the next several days, he documented the phenomena meticulously. Sounds without source, shapes in the darkness, and even changes in air pressure that seemed to correspond with the presence of unseen beings. Samuel eventually fled, but the forest's mark remained. He reported hearing whispers in his own home, noticing shadows moving independently, and feeling constant unease in any natural setting. Haunted forests share recurring elements across stories: isolation, manipulation of perception, and a sense of intelligent presence. Some visitors report that these woods are alive in a way that defies explanation, reacting to human emotion, thought, and movement. Others describe time distortion. Hours may feel like days, or minutes stretch endlessly, leaving travelers disoriented. Technology often fails. GPS signals drop, cameras malfunction, and compasses spin erratically. The woods appear to exist outside conventional rules, blending natural and supernatural boundaries. For some, the terror comes from what is seen. For others, it comes from what is not. Invisible presences, the sensation of being followed, and whispers that originate from nowhere can create a suffocating atmosphere. The mind becomes both observer and participant, constantly questioning reality. Many survivors describe heightened senses, as if the forest forces awareness of every sound, shadow, and movement. The experience is exhausting, both mentally and physically, and can lead to lasting psychological effects long after leaving the woods. Even seasoned outdoorsmen are not immune. Experience in wilderness navigation does not protect against phenomena that defy explanation. Often, the stories involve intelligent interaction with the forest, paths that move, trees that block progress, and shadows that track movements. The concept of safety becomes meaningless when the environment itself is active and aware. Survivors often recount feeling a mixture of awe and terror, a recognition that nature, in its most remote and untouched form, is a force beyond human comprehension. These forests exist in every corner of the world, often in remote regions where human presence is minimal. From dense North American woodlands to the isolated forests of Europe and Asia, tales of haunted woods share similarities. Visitors report anomalies, moving shadows, inexplicable lights, whispers, and a pervasive sense of being observed. While skeptics suggest natural explanations, optical illusions, animal behavior, or psychological stress, the consistency and intensity of reports hint at something more. Fear becomes an integral part of the experience. In these isolated places, the mind is stripped of distractions. Darkness, silence, and isolation amplify every sensation. The environment feels responsive, as though the trees themselves are guardians or predators, aware of human intrusion. Witnesses often describe a growing dread, a sense that leaving is not simply a matter of walking out, but of negotiating with forces beyond understanding. Survival is as much about maintaining mental fortitude as it is about physical skill. Finally, the lure of haunted woods is undeniable. Despite terrifying experiences, many are drawn back, seeking answers or thrills. Some enter out of curiosity, others out of a desire to confront fear itself. The results are rarely predictable. Some return with tales of subtle phenomena, while others experience events that are overtly supernatural, leaving indelible marks on their minds. The middle of nowhere is not just empty space. It is a testing ground for human courage, perception, and the limits of understanding. Even brief encounters with these haunted woods can leave permanent impressions. Visitors describe fleeting glimpses of figures in the corner of their vision, sudden drops in temperature, and sounds that vanish the moment they are focused on. Some swear they felt invisible hands brush against their skin or heard footsteps matching their own in perfect synchronization. It is in these fleeting moments that the woods reveal their true nature. Unpredictable, intelligent, and mercilessly observant. Many who escape these forests carry more than memories. They carry a lingering unease, a subtle tension that never fully dissipates. Some abandon hobbies, relocate, or avoid nature entirely, haunted by something no one else can see. Others are inexplicably drawn back, compelled by a curiosity they cannot rationalize. These woods, silent and remote, maintain an eternal vigilance, as if guarding a secret no human should ever uncover. In the end, the haunted forest is more than a place. It is an experience, a test, and a story waiting to consume anyone daring enough to wander too far into the middle of nowhere.